morning, 5th grade. We're ready for language lesson 164 today. Hopefully you watch these videos in the morning because I say good morning a lot, and hopefully that actually applies to when you're watching them. But if it's the afternoon, good afternoon, or evening, good evening. But I'm just guessing. I'm just taking a guess by saying good morning. So, good morning. Today we have our last lesson before a test, and then we are on our last chapter of our language book, which is so crazy. Our last final chapter of review for the year. So let's get into reviewing from this chapter for the test, which is coming up tomorrow. First of all, we're going to start off with going over our punctuation rules, and we're just kind of going to talk over them, and I will leave some blanks empty for you to try to answer the question and fill in the answer to see if you know your rules. So first of all, we're going to start with the comma rules, and you kind of fill in the blank as we review here. So use commas to separate how many items in a series. 3 or more, and they can be words or they can be groups of words. Use commas to separate how many adjectives that come before a noun. This is 2 or more. Use a comma before the conjunctions when they join parts of a compound sentence. Okay, so just remember that. And what are the conjunctions? And, but, or, nor, for, and yet. Use commas to separate items in dates and addresses. Let's just write an example of this right now. So the date today is April 30, 2020. So comma goes after the date, after the number of date. If we would say today is Thursday, April 30, you would also put a comma after Thursday. Now for writing an address, let's just write a random address here. 240 Jackson Street. I have no idea. Perry County, PA. 24637. Okay, so that was off the top of my head. Now, in the address, you need a comma between the town and the state, as you can see. Okay, so just look over that. Remember how you need commas in dates and addresses. Use a comma after the salutation of a friendly letter and after the closing of any letter. Use commas after well, yes, no, and why at the beginning of a sentence. Use commas to set off words of direct address. Now, what is direct address? That is when you're specifically talking to someone. You say their name, Marlene, what are you doing today? Okay, so then you put a comma after her name. That idea. Now, what about apostrophes? A contraction needs an apostrophe because a contraction is a word where you left out some letters. You put two words together and you left out some letters, so you put the apostrophe where the missing letters are. Can't, for example, is the contraction for cannot. So you put the apostrophe where you are missing letters. A possessive noun shows ownership or possession, and it always has an apostrophe. You also use apostrophes to show the plural of letters. Okay, so if you're talking about the letters of the alphabet and you're talking about more than one, you use apostrophe S after the letter. Colons. Use a colon between the hour and minute when you write the time. Use a colon after the salutation of a business letter. Use a colon between the chapter and verse when you write a scripture reference. Semicolons are to separate parts of a compound sentence if they are not joined by and, but, or, nor, for, and yet. So if you don't have your conjunction in there, you use a semicolon to connect those. Hyphen. Use a hyphen to divide a word at the end of a line. If you're writing and you can't fit a whole word onto a line, so you're putting part of it on the next line, you use a hyphen to divide that. Hyphen is just a little slash. Underlining, see if you can remember what needs to be underlined. Titles of what needs to be underlined. We have 3 things there. Books, magazines, and newspapers. Also, underline the names of, we have 8 more things here that need to be underlined. Just go ahead and name the things that you know, and then we'll go over them. What needs to be underlined? We have ships, trains, planes, plays, films, sculptures, paintings, and other works of art. And as we say, planes of art. You know what I mean by that, probably. Quotation marks. Use quotation marks before and after a direct quotation, which is the exact word that someone said. Remember, you also need a comma dividing who said it and what they said. And remember to punctuate the end of your sentence, and remember to capitalize the first word of your direct quotation. Now, use quotation marks before and after the titles of what? There are about 8 things here. See if you can name many of them, and I will list them off to you here shortly. What are they? What titles need quotation marks around them? Short stories, poems, songs, chapters, articles, and any other parts of books, magazines, and newspapers. Okay? Now, let's go over our steps for finding complements. First of all, find the verb. We're using these sentences here. So here we have our verb. Who or what is the subject? Matt is the subject. Matt told who or what. Now we are looking for a complement after we find our subject and verb. So let's go ahead and first of all, okay, so we have our subject, verb. Those are the first 2 steps. Now let's look at what kind of verb we have before we look at our complement actually. So is this an action or a linking verb? Told is an action verb, so we're looking for direct objects and indirect objects. So Matt told who or what? Matt told the score. So that is the direct object. Now if we have a direct object, we could have an indirect object before that. An indirect object answers to whom or for whom, and to what or for what. So Matt told the score to whom? Matt told the score to me, so that is the indirect object. And our last word here is an adjective. Okay, so next sentence, find our verb. Will be is our verb. Who or what will be? Mr. Smith is the subject. Now, what kind of verb do we have? Linking or action? Will be is a linking verb. So that means we have a predicate nominative or a predicate adjective following it. So if our complement is renaming our subject, it's a predicate nominative. If it is describing our subject, it is a predicate adjective. So what is teacher doing? Is it describing or renaming our subject? Could you call Mr. Smith a teacher? Yes, because he will be the teacher. So it is renaming the subject, which makes it a predicate nominative. And the is an adjective. Now, I cannot emphasize this enough. If you have an action verb, the complements following it will be direct objects and indirect objects. Say that with me. Action verb equals direct objects and indirect objects. Action verb equals direct objects and indirect objects. Action verb equals direct objects and indirect objects. Okay? I don't know if equals is the right word to use there, but basically, if you have complements after a direct object, it means they will be direct objects and indirect objects. Now, if you have complements after a linking verb, what kind of complements will they be? Predicate nominative, predicate adjective. So, linking verb means predicate nominative, predicate adjective, complements. Linking verb means predicate nominative, predicate adjective, complements. Say that with me. Linking verb means predicate nominative and predicate adjective complements. Please remember that. So, once we found our subject verb, we look for our complements, and then after we find our complements, if you read your predicate nominative in place of your subject. If it makes sense, it means you found the right thing. If it's a predicate adjective, try reading it before the subject to see if that makes sense, and then you found the right thing. For your direct objects and indirect objects, just read them after your subject and verb and see if that makes sense. Matt told me the score. That makes sense. So we found the correct direct and indirect object there. Now let's just quickly go over how to diagram these. So we have our first sentence. We have Matt told, and the direct object, remember, it goes on the line with the verb. There's a straight vertical line there dividing the verb and the direct object, okay? If you have an indirect object, it goes underneath the verb on a line, like that's how you would diagram a prepositional phrase. So your indirect object goes on the line just like that, okay? Now, if we're diagramming predicate nominatives and predicate adjectives, we have Mr. Smith will be. So, on the same line as our verb, we have, let me straighten out my line here a little bit. On the same line as the verb, we have our predicate nominatives and predicate adjectives with a slanted line pointing back to the subject. Because remember, the predicate nominatives and predicate adjectives are describing or renaming your subject, so it makes sense that our line points back to the subject. Okay, so that's how we diagram our predicate nominative. Now let's just go over our linking verbs to make sure we know what our linking verbs are. So what are the linking verbs? First of all, the state of being verbs can be linking verbs. So am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been. Say them with me. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, and been. And also are sometimes linking verbs. Now there's a fairly large list of them. Let me quickly, okay, on page 279, turn to page 279 if you do not have them memorized, and let's go over them a couple times together. Taste, feel, smell, sound, look, appear, become, seem, grow, remain, stay. Those are the sometimes linking verbs. Sometimes they are linking verbs and sometimes they are action verbs. Let's say them again. Taste, feel, smell, sound, look, appear, become, seem, grow, remain, and stay. Okay, so remember the questions, the direct objects answer what or who, and the questions, the indirect objects answer to whom or for whom, to what or for what. And then for predicate nominatives, remember they rename the subject, and predicate adjectives describe the subject. So your homework for today is to do Think B on page 289, and on page 290, do Think C and write D, and study for your test. This chapter starts on lesson 152, so it's the chapter on direct objects and complements. Well, that is a complement. Direct objects, indirect objects, predicate nominatives, predicate adjectives, and diagramming them and all of that. So study that, and if there's anything you feel like you don't remember in your test is mostly on this chapter, a little other review on a couple other things. So study for your test, whatever you feel like you need to study, and make sure you're ready for that tomorrow. Then we're ready for our last final review chapter. So thank you for listening to class today, and have a good rest of your day.